Cain is widely recognized as the Bible's first murderer, an infamous figure whose story continues to intrigue readers. According to Genesis, Cain, driven by jealousy and anger, takes the life of his younger brother Abel. In a moment of rage, he lures Abel into a field and kills him, committing the first act of fratricide recorded in biblical history. This act of violence leaves just 3 people alive, as far as we know: Cain, Adam and Eve. There wasn't much of a mystery about who the perpetrator was, yet the crime remains as grave as any to follow. In contrast to later biblical stories where God appears more distant, here he is directly involved, confronting Cain and condemning him to a lifetime of wandering, a fate that isolates him from society and leaves him cursed. The nature of this punishment has sparked centuries of debate and interpretation. God sentences Cain to roam the earth as a restless wanderer, which has led to speculation about whether this curse implies an element of immortality. Was Cain condemned to wander forever, or did he eventually meet a natural end like other humans? Did he perhaps live on, witnessing events far beyond Genesis? Some have even speculated that he might still be wandering to this day. The Genesis account itself gives limited details on Cain's fate. After God confronts him about Abel's death, he proclaims, "Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Genesis 4:11-12. This punishment is harsh, and Cain immediately expresses fear, noting that as a perpetual wanderer without a home, he would be vulnerable to being killed by others. In response, God places a protective mark on Cain and declares, "Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Genesis 4:15. The Bible later mentions that Cain eventually travels to the land of Nod, east of Eden, where he finds a wife and fathers a son named Enoch. He even goes on to build a city and names it after his son, suggesting a transition from wandering to some form of settled life. This development has often been interpreted as the conclusion of Cain's wandering, implying that he eventually found peace and stability, even raising a family. Many scholars believe that Cain likely lived a typical mortal life after this point. While the mark of God protected him from being killed by others, it did not shield him from aging, hunger, disease, or other natural causes. Cain could very well have grown old and passed away like any other mortal. Some interpretations even propose that Cain might have changed over time, possibly repenting for his sin, thereby allowing God to lessen his punishment. In this view, as Cain's remorse deepened, the mark might have been removed, and he would have been allowed to live out a normal human lifespan. A significant argument against Cain's continued existence into modern times is the biblical account of Noah's flood. Genesis 6 recounts that, after generations of increasing wickedness, God decides to cleanse the earth through a catastrophic flood, sparing only Noah's family and selected animals. This event is described as wiping out all life on earth, human, animal and otherwise, with only the creatures aboard Noah's ark surviving the deluge. If Cain were alive at this point, he would not have survived the flood unless he was specifically protected by God, which the text does not suggest. In Jewish tradition, additional insights about Cain's demise come from the Book of Jubilees, an ancient text that offers its own version of Cain's death. This account suggests that Cain might have died in an accident, such as a building collapse or some other misfortune. Such an accidental death would still align with God's original punishment, fulfilling the curse without extending Cain's life unnaturally. Since the Bible does not specify Cain's fate after he goes to the land of Nod, it leaves open a lingering question. Did Cain eventually meet his end? If he had been alive during the time of the flood, one would expect him to have perished in it, considering the flood's purpose was to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption. Yet, for some readers, this silence around Cain's ultimate fate has fueled theories suggesting that he might still be alive, cursed to walk the earth eternally. One perspective in favor of Cain's continued existence argues that because the Bible does not explicitly state that Cain died or was killed, he may indeed be wandering to this day. Some advocates of this theory argue that the mark placed on Cain by God is frequently misinterpreted as a sign of immortality. Although the mark did serve to protect him from being murdered by others, whether through inspiring fear or imposing divine protection, it does not imply invincibility in every sense. However, for those inclined to believe Cain is still roaming, the idea of his prolonged survival has persisted over generations, with some interpretations becoming particularly imaginative. One such argument suggests that after he left Eden and ventured into the land of Nod, Cain continued his life as a wanderer. After a time, he built a city he named after his son Enoch. But according to this theory, his nomadic existence didn't stop there. Instead, he may have resumed wandering or concealed his identity, eventually fading into obscurity, possibly to avoid recognition or punishment. Yet, this theory faces the significant challenge of the flood's occurrence. How could Cain have survived a deluge meant to obliterate nearly all life? Proponents argue that the mark of divine protection might have extended far enough to shield him even from this cataclysm. In this interpretation, the mark becomes not only a deterrent against murder, but an ironic shield that would allow Cain to survive into the new world post-flood, emerging into an era where fewer people would recognize or remember his true identity. Some proponents of Cain's lingering presence assert that his existence extends far beyond the pages of the Old Testament. They suggest that if one accepts the Bible's events as literal history, it's feasible to imagine Cain still wandering the earth today. In modern times, he might be hiding in plain sight as a drifter, cursed to an eternal life of hardship. Supporters of this theory often cite God's curse, which declared that the earth would yield nothing to Cain's labor. They take this as a metaphor that extends to every form of sustenance or prosperity, suggesting that Cain, no matter what he tries, would struggle endlessly to make a living, and that he would therefore appear in society as a homeless person or an eternal beggar, cursed to move endlessly and subsist on scraps. They believe this lack of material success or stability is a natural consequence of the curse, with Cain's life of wandering and want fitting the image of a modern drifter who can never fully settle down. Alternatively, another interpretation of Cain's possible survival suggests he might occupy an entirely different position in society, as a shadowy, powerful figure, perhaps even an elite ruler, wielding influence from behind the scenes. This line of thought contends that with thousands of years of existence, Cain would have accumulated unmatched knowledge, skills, and perhaps even powers. Having so much time to study human behavior, strategy, warfare, and survival, he would have gained abilities far beyond ordinary human potential. Supporters of this view suggest that Cain may have used his longevity to build a formidable intellect, mastering everything from self-defense to manipulation, and even, in some theories, the occult or ancient dark arts. With such an extensive repertoire of skills and knowledge, this theory posits that Cain may have quietly risen to the top of society in ancient times, and from that point simply maintained his status. Over centuries, he might have learned to control his surroundings, exerting influence or dominance, perhaps even managing to shape history to his advantage. Far from being a wandering outcast, Cain would be a secret ruler, a figure who not only survived the flood and the centuries after, but adapted to become a hidden power in the world. These two competing images of Cain, as a struggling drifter cursed to a life of poverty, or as an immortal elite wielding secret influence, offer two vastly different interpretations of his possible survival. While there is no textual evidence to confirm either perspective, both ideas reflect enduring fascination with Cain's mysterious fate and the powerful allure of a figure whose punishment may have been far more profound and lasting than the early chapters of Genesis suggest. Another interesting theory suggests that Cain might actually be the legendary Sasquatch or Bigfoot, According to this view, he is not only a wanderer, but has also transformed into a reclusive, beast-like figure who dwells far from human society, secluded in wilderness caves and remote areas. In this interpretation, Cain's curse of isolation has led him to roam distant forests and mountains, existing on the fringes of civilization, where he remains hidden yet constantly present. The 17th century Hebrew text known as the Book of Jasher presents another narrative for Cain's ultimate fate, offering an account that many readers find compelling and final. In this version, Cain's life concludes in a rather unexpected manner. Long after Cain's exile, Lamech, a descendant of Cain's brother Seth and known to be blind, was out hunting with his son, Tubal-Cain. During their expedition, Tubal-Cain spotted what he thought was an animal at a distance. Unsure of the shape he saw moving on the horizon, Tubal-Cain instructed his father Lamech to shoot. Lamech, relying on his son's guidance and unaware of what exactly he was aiming at, drew back his weapon and successfully struck his target. However, the figure on the horizon wasn't a wild animal but Cain himself, and Lamech's arrow struck him fatally in the heart. This story implies that, contrary to some beliefs, the mark placed on Cain by God didn't actually make him invincible. Instead, it might have served as a stark warning to others, making it clear that anyone who attempted to kill Cain would face severe consequences, with divine vengeance dealt out sevenfold against them. This threat was perhaps enough to keep most people at a safe distance, avoiding confrontation with Cain throughout his life. Yet in the end, it was a tragic accident, rather than an intentional act that brought about his death, with his own descendant Lamech unwittingly taking his life. Another ancient Jewish text, the Book of Jubilees, offers a different version of Cain's demise. Here, Cain's end comes not through another person, but rather through what might be seen as divine irony. According to this narrative, Cain's life ends when his own house collapses on him. This dramatic ending serves as a poetic form of retribution. Just as Cain killed his brother Abel with a rock, he is ultimately killed by a similar means, crushed beneath the stones of his own shelter. This idea reflects a sense of divine justice, where Cain, who had sinned by shedding innocent blood, meets his own fate in a similar manner. As the text poetically puts it, "For with a stone he had killed Abel, and by a stone was he killed in righteous judgment." In this account, Cain's death is seen not just as an accident, but as the culmination of his actions, where the very tool he used for murder becomes the instrument of his punishment. Ultimately, the notion of Cain's unending wandering, or conversely, his death by accident or divine retribution, continues to be a topic of great intrigue and theological reflection. The Bible remains silent on Cain's ultimate fate, leaving room for interpretation and debate. His story raises profound questions about sin, punishment, repentance, and divine justice, as well as the nature of humanity's first murder and the consequences that followed. The possibility that Cain might still be wandering the earth, or that he transformed into a figure like Bigfoot, speaks to humanity's fascination with enigmatic figures who seem to transcend time. Alternatively, his abrupt end, as described in texts like the Book of Jasher and Book of Jubilees offers a different kind of closure, one where Cain's punishment takes on a more finite, albeit ironic form. Let me know your thoughts on these theories. Do you believe Cain's fate was sealed in Genesis? Or is it possible he's out there somewhere, still wandering as a symbol of isolation and eternal punishment? And as always, if you enjoyed today's discussion, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more explorations of history's greatest mysteries. Until next time.